Hello and welcome to PTV World. I am Jawad Tehami and you're watching the special live transmission regarding Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan's historic visit, two-day official visit that he undertook to Russia. All eyes were set on that particular visit in which he held a 3-hour-long one-on-one meeting with President Vladimir Putin. A number of issues between President Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Imran Khan came under discussion, including Islamophobia, Afghanistan, this dire humanitarian and the economic crisis the war-torn country is faced with. The other issues that included was the energy cooperation, trade and economic ties. And now Prime Minister, along with his delegation, is back from that historic tour. And there was a statement by the Foreign Office yesterday after the meeting between President Vladimir Putin and Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan that both the leaders discussed a wide range of issues. Similar statement came from the Kremlin as well, that both the leaders discussed the bilateral issues in order to strengthen the bilateral cooperation in diverse fields as well as the regional and international issues. And to talk more about the significance of this particular historic visit by Prime Minister Imran Khan to Russia, I am joined by an esteemed panel of guests today in the studio. I am joined by Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, who is an international relations expert. Thank you very much for being with us at PTV World for this special transmission. And I'm also joined by Ms. Najma Minhas, who is a senior analyst. She's also joining me in the studio. Thank you very much for your time at PTV World as well. And I'm also joined by Mr. Mark Selboda, who is a senior analyst. He is joining me on Skype. Mr. Selboda, thank you very much for being with us at PTV World. So I'll begin the discussion with you. How this particular tour of Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has been viewed in Russia. A statement from the Kremlin, although it was brief initially, that a host of issues have been discussed between President Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Imran Khan, including bolstering the bilateral cooperation, the regional issues and the international issues as well.
Yeah, as you have alluded to, this was a particularly historic visit. I think that the visit was received well by the Kremlin and the Russian people, and I take it by the Pakistani people as well. Imran Khan, upon first landing, he commented to the press that it was, particularly exciting, interesting to be in Russia in such exciting times. As Russia intervenes in Ukraine to protect the people of East Ukraine, of Donbass, from the U.S.-backed regime there. The two discussed a host of bilateral issues and the improvement of trade, but they also had substantive discussions on the nature of Islam in their respective societies and politics, because Russia has the largest Islamic population in Europe. And it is seen as a very good foundation for what are already substantially improving Pakistani-Russian relations moving forward.
Mr. Selboda, I've taken your point well. I'll take this point to Ms. Najma. I'd like you to be with us during this transmission as well. Ms. Najma, when we talk about this particular historic tour of Prime Minister Imran Khan, it has its significance. After 23 years of gap, any of Premier of Pakistan has visited Russia on the special invitation of the Russian leadership. A host of issues, including bilateral trade and the regional issue that particularly when we talk about Afghanistan was discussed. So when we talk about the dire humanitarian crisis and the economic situation in Afghanistan, what areas do you think Russia and Pakistan can collaborate in order to avert that?
Well, I think the biggest issue is, like you said, it's a historic trip and they discussed many, many issues. Afghanistan obviously was a big agenda item on that. Energy cooperation was another one, and they've done other technology cooperation agreements and so on and so forth. On Afghanistan in specifically, Prime Minister went because this is not the first time that he's having this discussion on Russia. On Afghanistan with the Russian president. They've discussed this before, and Russia has been a key partner on Afghanistan for the past 1.5, 2 years, we're seeing more and more meetings happening in Russia the past 1 year. There's a lot the two countries can do together. The recognition of Afghanistan is something that, of course, Pakistan is lobbying for. The humanitarian issue itself, bringing food to Afghanistan, is another issue that is a crucial humanitarian issue right now. So I think these are the two focuses that the Prime Minister has. One is the recognition of Afghanistan, and the other is the humanitarian element of it, which is food, getting food and other goods to Afghanistan.
So, Dr. Jaspal, when we talk about the counterterrorism efforts between Pakistan and Russia, Russia has taken a very cautious approach, especially after the international coalition troops withdrawal back in 2021. And there seems to be a similarity of views between Pakistani authorities and the Russian authorities when it comes to holding the Taliban to stick around with the promise that they made in the Doha peace deal, that the Afghan soil is not to be used against any other country.
I think that you are very right in this context, and as Dr. Najma already pointed out, with that reference, if you focus Afghanistan and why what is a convergence of interest? Convergence of interest is how to tackle the Daesh. Convergence of interest is how to tackle the Al-Qaeda leftovers. Convergence of interest is how to tackle the Islamic movement of Turkestan, Islamic movement from Uzbekistan, or Eastern Turkestan movement, these kind of the things. And they have connections not only in Pakistan like TTP, they have connections with the militant groups, radicalized militant groups in Dagestan, Chechnya. So this is a very, very important for our survival. And in this emerging geopolitical environment, if you see where you can use the proxies against one another, and these are very well versed proxies. They could be used against China, Russia, Pakistan. I'm not saying that who will be used. Let's say India is using it in Pakistan, so that is the one very important convergence of interest on the Afghanistan. Stability in Afghanistan, going to lead a stability in Pakistan, Russia, China, and permitting the connectivity with CIS states, which are the Russians think that they are stakeholders of it. Second is, in this context, without this stability, this energy, which we are looking, for example, fourth time I think this Norwegian and other who are supplying the liquefied gas, they are not permitting us. Pakistan has been facing these kind of the crises. But if there will be TAPI, CASA 1000, or if there will be a new, what we call it, Uzbekistan and Pakistan track, and our own commodities like Pakistan's agriculture commodities like citrus and these kinds of things can go from Afghanistan to Central Asia to Russia. So for all these things, you need a stability in the region, and that stability can only come when there is a convergence of security domain convergence between the Chinese, Russians, and the Pakistanis. And second is that if you see in this visit, I think it's a very strong message that Pakistan is now not making a foreign policy with zero-sum game approach. Earlier we were making this approach that, okay, if we are dealing with the Americans, Americans should not deal with India, or they cannot do with us. Now we are saying, okay, if we are dealing with the Russians, Russians can sell their weapons to India. It's their market, it's not our problem. We have our own interests. Similarly as China. This is, I think, the modern trend in the global politics, which we people have to realize, not only at the government, it seemed realization, but at the academic, at the media level, that this is the world in which we are living. Making a foreign policy based on this paradigm of zero-sum game is not workable. I think that is.
So, Ms. Najma, when we talk about the mutual collaboration between Russian authorities and Pakistan in order to ensure that the Afghan soil is not used against any other country, what possible strategy both can collectively chalk out in order to ensure that?
Well, obviously, I mean, as Dr. Zafar pointed out, the counter-terrorism strategy is something that they can closely work on together. And that is what they're going to be looking at in terms of making sure that we don't have this attacks on Pakistan or Russia or in different parts of where Muslim states are. So, for example, even China is at risk as well, right? So you need to ensure that no one else uses this territory. But when we talk about, there are two elements to it. There's the TTP element, and that is much more of a Pakistan, Afghanistan type of conversation that needs to happen. And then there is the ISIS and the Daesh and all the other acronyms that we have, where you are thinking about other players that might be using those players, those non-state actors, to attack the regional countries. So that includes Central Asia and Russia. Who is using them? I mean, I don't want to name any particular country, but especially now when we're seeing there is issues going on in Russia's own neighborhood and background, maybe international superpowers may decide to use Afghanistan, given the uncertainty of what's happening in Afghanistan, as a base to launch non-state actors.
So, Dr. Jaspal, you just alluded to the fact that stability and the security remains to be the key for the economic revival. I'll take your version on this particular thing. For now, I'm joined by a new guest in the transmission, Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh, who is joining me on Skype, former ambassador. Mr. Sheikh, thank you very much for your time at PTV World during this special live transmission regarding Pakistan's Prime Minister's historic visit to Russia. He has discussed a host of issues with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and there was a statement by Pakistan's Foreign Office that Afghanistan, Islamophobia, and then energy cooperation, and then Prime Minister's statement went on to say that the cordiality and the trust between the two countries will further strengthen and deepen the bilateral relationship between the two countries. How do you see it? Does it depict a success on the part of Pakistani authorities?
Well, look, I think we have to look at the historical perspective. People talk about the fact that this visit by the Prime Minister, by a Prime Minister last 3 years. But of course, we have maintained contact with Russia. President Sharaf visited, President Zardari visited, and therefore there is a history of a relationship seeking developed over a period of time. That relationship has been concretized by the agreements that we've reached with them, particularly the agreement on the North-South pipeline and the agreement that we reached in 2021 about financing and the implementation of that particular project. Now, these are, of course, things that have to be weighed against the fact that people say that the visit was ill-timed. This is not the way foreign policy is conducted. In foreign policy, if you make a commitment and you want a particular relationship to develop, then do not back out of that commitment because of more recent developments. So I feel Prime Minister Imran Khan did the right thing in going to Russia, and I think he did the right thing in also recalling the stance that Pakistan has taken along with some other countries with regard to the fact that Ukraine is a problem that needs to be resolved peacefully and not through use of force if it is at all possible. So I think developing relations with Russia should not be made conditional on this that Russia is taking in other directions. Uh, perhaps, I think it's necessary also to recall in terms of relationship with the United States. The United States uh, Department of State spokesman said very clearly that we have a special relationship with Pakistan, which we are seeking to develop, and that each country has the responsibility to react according to its perceptions to developments in Ukraine. So I think in that sense, we are treading a fine line, uh, being accused of reneging on or betraying Ukraine, because we have also said to Ukraine in 2021, Ukraine has been a very important defense partner for us, and I think it continues to be an important partner. It continues to be an important partner in terms of the wheat that it supplies, and it's an important partner in terms of the relationship that it has with the countries that matter in Central Asia. So I think we should uh, think in terms of the relationship as something that will develop perhaps at a much slower pace than would otherwise have happened. But with the sanctions that have now been imposed by uh, Biden and by some of the European countries, it seems to me that it will be difficult to implement some of the agreements that we have reached with Russia, but that does not mean that we should try keep that prospect alive.
Mr. Sheikh, your point is well taken. Mr. Selboda, when we talk about the trade and economic cooperation between Pakistan and Russia, Pakistan's Prime Minister has said that the Pakistan Stream gas pipeline project happens to be the flagship project when it comes to trade and economic cooperation between the two countries. Given the new circumstances at the global level, as Mr. Sheikh has just alluded to, that there are fresh sanctions which are being imposed by the US and its Western allies on Russia. So there were new sanctions on the major banks of Russia as well. Do you think it would be an uphill task for Pakistan and Russia to go ahead with the projects like as the project of Pakistan Stream gas pipeline project?
Yeah.
Well, sorry, did you address that question to me?
Mr. Sheikh, this question is for Mr. Selboda. Mr. Selboda, please go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you. Russia has weathered years of economic warfare by the United States and its allies via over 100 packages of sanctions. And they have had a relatively, thus up to this far, a minimal impact on the Russian economy. In fact, you can say that in some areas, the Russian economy, particularly agriculture and manufacturing, that it has actually been a big boon. As Russia's agriculture has grown in response to the sanctions and counter sanctions to meet domestic demand. And Russia is exporting much more now in terms of agriculture as well because of that growth. When it comes to the energy sector, the U.S. is attempting to sanction Russian banks and the energy industry to prevent their access to financial capital markets used for investment and the construction of such projects. But the problem is that increasingly U.S., as it resorts to sanctions as a weapon of economic warfare and punishment, not only against its adversaries, but even against its own allies, right? Sanctioning Germany over Nord Stream 2, sanctioning Turkey over the purchase of S-400 air defense systems, and threatening even to do the same to India. It's finding that these sanctions are becoming less of an effective tool because so much of the international capital market is now outside of their direct control. And particularly with relations with Pakistan, also with Russia and China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there is access to other capital and development markets that could be tapped there for the construction of these energy pipelines and connections. So I think there will be hurdles that is inevitable, particularly in this world where the U.S. is so overweening using its economy as a tool of foreign policy pressure. Sanctions are almost the price of an independent foreign policy in today's world, unfortunately. But I'm confident that because of the dividends that Pakistan and Russia will both find from the construction and development of these energy connections, that the projects will go forward and will be completed.
Mr. Selboda, very important and pertinent points that you've raised over here. Mr. Selboda and Mr. Sheikh, please stay with us. I'll take Dr. Jaspal's point on this. When it comes to the new sanctions which have been imposed by the US and Western allies, particularly on Russia, as Mr. Selboda just alluded to the fact, there are a number of other countries, including Turkey, as well. There are sanctions over them as well on the purchase of S-400 from Russia. So he's of the view that they are not any more effective as they used to be in the past. Don't you think they are going to affect the Western nations even harder as compared to what effect they desire after imposing it on the other countries?
I partially agree with you, Mark, because the sanctions are important for a developing state, especially like Pakistan, and not for the Europeans. He's correct, because when they impose or levy the sanctions against Russia, the sanctions are basically energy related, and entire Europe is dependent on the Russian energy supply, cheaper Russian energy supply. If you recall, Trump tried to, in one of the EU or NATO meeting, compel the previous chancellor of, force the previous chancellor that she cancel this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but she refused. Though Germans coined with them on this that they are not issuing the license for the start of the gas
But a couple of days before the approval process
has been
only delay,
but for how long they will delay. So this time sanctions will be going to ruin the entire Europe. So this is the first point. Second is that today what he's saying, what I said, that what my understanding is that China is a big market. Russia itself is a big energy market. And if these two countries' interests converge and they try to bypass the international, you can say these banks or these things, they are able to manage it. But the problem for us is that our prime objective, where security is one side, the other is this gas pipeline. Starting from Karachi to Kasur, 1100 kilometer gas pipeline to 2.5 billion. And we are working for it since 2015. And our gas pipeline coming from the Iran was also scuttled that project because of the sanctions. So for us, sanction in that context, now we have to see how the Russians are going to work out it. If they are managed it, and Russians have a good history here. If you see in case of Pakistan's OGDC, oil and gas and development, in the 60s, all their rigs were developed by the Russians. So Russians know this terrain and how we can do, and it's easier for us also to accommodate. But of course, sanctions, we have to wait and see. The point here is that here comes where the Mark and the other people are saying, if the sanctions were really meant something, then they were able to prevent our nuclear programs, you can say evolutionary trajectory. They were able to prevent the Putin stepping into this Ukraine, or they were able to prevent us from dealing with number of things, because Americans are always threatening us with sanctions. Indirectly, Pakistan is now facing a sanction type of, though they are not sanctioned, but they are not giving us, and we are habitual. And here I would like to add it in Pakistan's foreign policy, what we have learned in the last 7 decades, that wherever Prime Minister is going anywhere, he comes back, there is some approvals. But we fail to learn, as Najma and Sheikh was our former foreign secretary, that your foreign policy laid down 3-4 decades ahead, and you start pursuing those benchmarks. So in that context, if we see, I think that these sanctions may be for 1 year, 2 years, sooner world market has to reboot, and then the sanctions will be over. So we have to not be afraid of this kind of sanctions.
So Ms. Najma, what do you think? Because we saw in a statement by Prime Minister Imran Khan himself, since Dr. Jaspal also alluded to the fact that this particular gas pipeline project was agreed upon back in 2015. It was because of some sanctions which were already in place on certain companies from Russia, that this couldn't be realized in full. So how do you think Pakistan and Russia can maneuver through this sanctions regime in order to materialize this specific project?
So I think it's important, first of all, that the sanctions that have been imposed so far are not very wide encompassing. They're still limited to certain areas. So, for example, the US has imposed sanctions on certain individuals, not the whole state of Russia. They've imposed sanctions on certain banks, not all the banking system in Russia.
But major banks, the biggest bank of Russia, of course.
The 4 banks in Russia.
Yeah.
And one of them is the second largest bank. So the first largest bank, I mean, as far as I understand, that has not been for some reason in that list yet. But Russian reserves are around $600 billion, and only around 12 to 16% of those are in dollars, right? And the way the world has developed the last several years, where China is now probably at par with the US in terms of economic superiority, or prowess, I should say, there is a huge capacity there for us to start thinking about currency swaps, and China has increasingly done this with different countries. So there is potential for Pakistan. So if I look at it one angle in terms of economics, the potential for Pakistan is to trade with Russia via China in terms of currency swaps maybe, so there's a potential there, or with Russia directly in terms of currency swaps. But okay, so if we leave that to a side and let's say they have to trade in dollars and so on, this company, the private sector company right now, which is actually going to be building, if the agreement takes place, the pipeline, is not currently one of the sanctioned companies. So right now we're still okay as far as that goes. But if sanctions do happen, then this is going to be an issue. And as Zafar Jaspal said, we might have to sit it out. And the bigger issue is what's happened to Iran, and we've not been able to build those pipelines because of that, the IPI pipeline, for example. So that is an issue there. But I think there is ways of going around this particular sanction.
Going around about
it's not going to be easy, though.
Okay, Mr. Sheikh, when we talk about another important issue that was discussed between Prime Minister Imran Khan and President Vladimir Putin, it was related to Islamophobia. We saw a statement coming from President Vladimir Putin. He said that the publication of blasphemous caricatures was not artistic, rather it was a violation of religious freedom. It was warmly reciprocated by Prime Minister Imran Khan. How do you think Pakistan and Russia collectively go ahead on this front, given the fact there are rising incidents of Islamophobia, particularly when we talk about India and some Western countries as well?
Well, let me just comment first on the actual situation as I see it, in terms of the prospects for the agreements that we reached with Russia being implemented. I note that the point has been made that the company that is going to be responsible for the North-South pipeline is not one of the companies that has been sanctioned. But I think we should be prepared for the fact that as President Biden extends the number of sanctions that are applied along with his Western allies, these may become more difficult. I think this is one of the realities that we must recognize, that what we want and what is just and what is correct is probably not going to happen. But that is one thing that we should bear in mind. Second, with regard to Islamophobia, I think that there is a complete meeting of minds between President Putin and Prime Minister Imran Khan, because for their own reasons, their population now has about 145 million Muslims are in the Soviet Union and in the near abroad that they consider the Central Asian republics to be. These are countries that are susceptible to the fact that if Islam is criticized and Islam is termed as with disrespect, then extremism will flourish, and therefore the Russians have Russia has and President Putin has a particular interest in ensuring that he and Prime Minister Imran Khan can together combat this and prevent the spread of extremism, separatism, etc. Now, why, as I said, there are 145 million Muslims in Russia and in the near abroad, and this is one of the reasons why Putin is extremely concerned about the fact that there should be no aspect of Islam that is subject to criticism of the nature that is occurring in the West. Whether this will continue in that particular direction is something that we have to watch for.
Mr. Selboda, what's your take on this particular thing when it comes to Islamophobia? Pakistan's Prime Minister has been very vocal. In fact, he raised that issue at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly as well. And then we saw the statement coming from President Vladimir Putin. Since Mr. Sheikh has alluded to the fact there is a considerable chunk of population there in Russia that happens to be Muslim, what collaboration on what international fora do you think both the countries can raise this issue in order to counter it?
Yeah, certainly there is, the World Islamic Council, but I think that the bilateral relations are particularly significant at this time. I think that Russia is an example of a country where Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and Islam have long lived with extremely good relations, hand in hand, with very little incidences historically of religious-based hatred or violence between the two communities. In fact, even at the time, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she visited Kazan in Russia, remarked on how it was an example of how the two great world religions can live in peace, going back centuries. And I think it's significant that when Imran Khan visited Russia, he not only met with President Putin, but the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, also specially flew up to Moscow specifically for the interests of meeting Prime Minister Khan and, presenting himself as a representative of the Russian and the near abroad Islamic community. And there are also possible relations directly. I mean, Chechnya has broad autonomy within Russia, and is a powerful voice for Muslims in Russia outside of Chechnya as well. So I think those personal contacts that were developed between Imran Khan and Kadyrov could also bear a lot of fruit in terms both social, cultural, religious, and economic.
Mr. Selboda and Mr. Sheikh, please stay with us. Dr. Jaspal, when we talk about another important regional issue that happens to be the Kashmir dispute, it's a long-standing dispute for a long time now for Pakistan, and there had been some talk about it at the international fora as well. Now, how do you think Pakistan's Prime Minister has highlighted the atrocities which are being committed by the Indian armed forces over there, especially after the curfew almost 2 years back and the complete communication blackout? How do you think Pakistan can impress upon the Russian authorities in future so that they can help good Indian authorities' conscience to stop those atrocities?
I think that Kashmir is a very important issue for us, and Prime Minister himself highlighted, and according to the reports that Prime Minister also discussed the same issue and tried to sensitize the President Putin on this issue as well. Now, if we are expecting from Russia that they will support us on the Kashmir, I think it's too much expectation. We should be very much realistic. Though there is a change in the last 3 decades when we started engaging the Russians and Russians started responding, starting with the first in mid-90s and then Prime Minister Nawaz, then President Musharraf, then President Zardari, and now Prime Minister Imran Khan. In this process, what is the outcome? The good outcome is at least this stance which always we had seen on the Russians case, that there was very hard, fast stance in favor of the Indians. Now it is not changing. So that will be, so even if they can, they remain a little bit silent, a little bit cautious, concerned, I think that is a big achievement of Pakistan's foreign policy or diplomacy. But at the same time, when you are saying Islamic phobia, that is also linked with this, because when the Muslims in Kashmir or in India, when they are marginalized, they are killed or humiliated, naturally it generates militancy, because reaction is in the militancy, and that we find it. And if you have to get rid of this entire militancy, then you have to condemn the India, that no one is, even, it's very interesting. I am with the Ukraine, I am not interested in the aggression, I do not support it, but at the same time, everyone is talking about the Putin's aggression, but no one was talking about the Indians' aggression in Kashmir. More than 800,000 troops are there, and there is all kind of the atrocities have been taking place, and we haven't seen neither European conscious, neither others conscious have been making. And when we are at the verge of a nuclear, you can say, conflict, when we had an air combat, and India lost 2, no one was talking about. So we have to see and be, I think, careful, though it's a duty or a responsibility of the government of Pakistan as well as Pakistanis as an individual, that we must stand with our Kashmir cause. We can hammer it, we can sensitize the international community that what would be happen if there is a unleashing of this or escalation of this conflict, and I think Prime Minister did a good job.
Dr. Jaspal, your point is well taken. Ms. Najma, what do you think, as Dr. Jaspal alluded to the fact that there hasn't been that much of anything concrete done on the part of the Western nations in order to resolve the Kashmir dispute, and this particular point happens to be the nuclear flashpoint, but we have seen this issue being raised at the United Nations Security Council after a long time, and then it was talked about in the European Parliament as well as in the British Parliament, and the international human rights organizations also condemning all those atrocities. Russia being the veto member of the Security Council, it holds a significant position over there. So how do you think it can play the role in order to help resolve this lingering dispute?
So I think that, as Jaspal pointed out, that we shouldn't get too excited. I mean, this is a relationship that has just started warming up. After 23 years, our first elected prime minister went to Russia. So we really need to work on our relationship with Russia as a bilateral relationship before we can actually think about what else that they can help us on. In particular, of course, yes, they can help us on Islamophobia, because that is a general philosophical discussion that's taking place, and Putin can make remarks to that effect and can work on that. But to expect that Russia will all of a sudden in the next 1 year suddenly change its position on Kashmir is unrealistic. What, however, it can do is, over time, as your relationship develops, and you have a strengthening of relationship, let's say on an issue like Islamophobia, that can help your overall relationship with regard to Kashmir as well. The reason is that Islamophobia, for example, if there is a country right now that is epitomizing Islamophobia, it's actually India, more than the West. I mean, we all talk about the West, but actually, where is Islamophobia right now happening? It's on a practical level,
right.
On a day-to-day level, it's happening in India. Story after story about Muskan Khans all over Karnataka, the rest of India are taking place, right?
Right.
So women in India, Muslims in India are being subjugated.
Being marginalized.
As a result of
Najma,
that.
Minhas, senior analyst, thank you very much for being with us during this special live transmission, being in the studio. Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, international relations expert. You're also joining me in the studio. And I was also joined by Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh on Skype, a former ambassador, and Mr. Mark Selboda, who is a senior analyst, joining me on Skype. Thank you very much for your time as well. We really appreciate your time. So all eyes are still set on the outcomes of Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan's historic visit to Russia, and we're looking forward that this relationship strengthens in the future as well, as per the Prime Minister Imran Khan's statement. And with this, we come to the end of this part of the special transmission, and we'll be heading towards the headlines of the hour.